Welcome back, guys, for our final video in our World War I unit. And in this video, while we will certainly explore World War I more, our main focus is on what's going on in Russia during the war and then shortly after the war. We're going to look at a couple of revolutions and a bloody civil war in Russia, and the end result being a new country emerging from Russia. Let's get into the history of it. So we need to go back to World War I, of course. Now remind me, before the war, Russia had belonged to which one? Triple Alliance or Triple Entente? The answer, of course, is the Triple Entente. And then during the actual war, was Russia part of the Allies or the Central Powers? The answer was Allies. Okay, so that's kind of the lay of the land where it has been. Now, you might remember that the reason Russia got into the war in the first place is they had been backing up Serbia. Serbia had been declared war on by Austria because of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Let's think about Russia as a country getting ready for a massive worldwide war. And we know Russia is a country that has struggled with its size and kind of keeping up with other European countries in terms of technology and social reforms and political reforms. So let's look at how the war actually changes Russia. So at first, there was a fair amount of support and enthusiasm for the war. But after that initial phase of happiness wears off, the reality of war sets in, and Russia was not prepared for this war. Their generals weren't terribly great. There was never enough supplies for the soldiers. The distances in Russia were vast that you have to cover, and the losses that piled up were absolutely staggering. And it got so bad that Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, went to the front lines and took personal control of the army, assuming he could do better than his generals. And that turns out to not really be the case. Here is Nicholas inspecting his soldiers. Again, how bad was it in Russia? There were soldiers going into battle in Russia who had no ammunition. They just had a rifle. In some cases, soldiers went into battle literally with nothing. They had no rifle or no ammunition, and they were expected to basically just kind of pick up what they could find on the battlefield from fallen soldiers to continue the fight. And you can kind of tell from this picture of these Russian soldiers that they were just not well equipped. They just look kind of ragtag. They look depressed. They look like they're not ready for a massive modern war. Now, as Nicholas is off on the front lines leading the war effort, the royal family back home grows increasingly unpopular. And this is not just because of the losses in the war. While Nicholas is doing the generaling on the front line, his wife, Alexandra, is kind of like the woman ruling over Russia. Kind of, the day-to-day affairs falls to her to do. Well, a little bit of background on Alexandra, it tells you a lot about what we need to know. She was originally from Germany. Okay, she was a German princess who came to Russia to marry Nicholas. So we're at war with Germany, and a German princess is ruling over Russia. That's going to create some problems. Furthermore, the only son among the children that Nicholas and Alexandra had, his name was Alexei. He was born with hemophilia, which is a life-threatening medical condition where your blood doesn't clot properly. And even small cuts and bruises can be life-threatening. Now, this guy on the left, his name is Rasputin. He was a Russian, reportedly, anyways, holy man from Siberia. And he seemed to have some sort of power to heal Alexei. And Alexandra fell increasingly under his spell. And so a lot of Russian nobles disliked that. They didn't trust Rasputin, and they felt that the Empress, Alexandra, was kind of losing control over Russia. All right, let's look now at a revolution. So by March or February in the old calendar of 1917, Russia finds itself on the brink of revolution. And think back to other revolutions we've looked at this year. The price of what commodity is at the heart of a lot of those revolutions? And the answer, of course, is bread. And so workers are going on strike. Workers are going hungry. They're taking to the streets to protest, demanding bread. And soldiers are sent out to put down these rebellions. They're ordered to fire on the protesters, and the soldiers refuse. In fact, they join with the protesters. And so Nicholas's control over his country begins to evaporate very, very quickly. And in fact, it gets so bad that on March 2nd, 1917, Czar Nicholas II steps down, abdicates his throne, and the royal family become basically, they go into what you might call house arrest. So we know that by early 1917, most Russians had lost faith in this war, and so the new government that replaces Nicholas, you would think then that they would want to end the war. But that is not the case. The government that replaces Nicholas is known as the provisional government. Provisional means temporary. And by continuing to involve Russia in this pointless, bloody mess of a war, this provisional government loses what little support it had among the people. Instead, what's happening is people are starting to put their faith not in the official government of Russia, but in these unofficial governments called Soviets. So Soviets were these councils of workers. So maybe at your factory, you guys at your factory elect a couple people to kind of represent that factory, and then they report to a larger committee, and you have this shadow government that's getting to have more control and influence than the real government. This brings us to the man who is synonymous with the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin. So Lenin was a revolutionary and communist that had spent a lot of time, in trouble under the days of the Tsar. In fact, so much so he had basically been exiled out of the country. He was living in Switzerland at the time this was going on. But he hears about this revolution back in his home country of Russia, and he wants to get back to Russia so that he can lead his own revolution in that country. So let's get into that second revolution, the November Revolution. Now, Germany, why would they be excited that Russia's going through a revolution? And the answer, of course, is Germany's fighting a two-front war against France and Britain in the West and Russia in the East. Anything that weakens Russia helps Germany tremendously. So what they do is the Germans allow, let me go back to the map here, they allow Lenin to travel from Switzerland back to Russia. And this allows Lenin to get back to his home country, and Germany is encouraging this because they know Lenin is a troublemaker, and he's basically a time bomb that they're planting in Russia. And there's Lenin. He's arrived back in Russia. There's a guy named Trotsky and Stalin. We're going to talk about Trotsky and Stalin later. Lenin's his followers rather, who are working for him and willing to fight for him, are known as Bolsheviks. And this is a great example of Lenin's propaganda because Lenin's radical communist followers were a relatively small group in Russia. They were a minority, for sure. But the name Bolshevik means the majority. So Lenin calls them the majority, even though they're not, to try to make them sound stronger than they really are. Now, Lenin is, though, gaining strength because he's got a pretty catchy slogan. He calls it peace, land, and bread. In other words, if the Bolsheviks take over and Lenin's put into charge, the Russian people will get peace, land, and bread. There's Lenin talking to the crowd. There is Joseph Stalin. Again, we're going to talk a lot about him in just a few minutes. So this all culminates in what's known as the November Revolution. It's also known as the October Revolution because Russia was using a different calendar at the time. So, but let's not get confused by that. The important thing is this is known as the Bolshevik Revolution also because this final revolution is going to put the Bolsheviks in charge because they're going to overthrow that provisional government that had replaced Nicholas when he had been overthrown earlier in 1917. So now Lenin is in charge of Russia, and his slogan was peace, land, bread. And so we know that means the war with Germany has got to come to an end. So Lenin signs a separate peace with Germany. What I mean by separate peace is this is not a peace treaty that Britain and France, who had been Russia's allies, had agreed to. They had all agreed to only sign with Germany if all countries agreed. So Russia pulls out of this, which is going to free up a lot of German soldiers then to go focus on the Western Front, something that the Western allies hated and felt betrayed by the Russians for doing this. So that's the peace part. The land part means giving out land to the peasants. So the way Russia had functioned really for most of its history was you had these wealthy landowners who owned vast amounts of land, and then the poor serfs and peasants who lived on them had very little to call their own. They lived pretty sad and poor lives. And so by taking lands from the rich and giving to the poor, what Lenin is doing is basically buying the support of the Russian peasants because they're going to remember who gave them land. All right, now let's talk about the Russian Civil War. So we looked at those two revolutions, right? The first one where the Tsar fell, and the second one where the Bolsheviks took over. Turns out not everybody in Russia, however, was totally thrilled about the communist Bolsheviks taking over. They wanted to undo that revolution. And so a group formed that we're going to refer to as the Whites. So the White Russians were basically a kind of an umbrella of different groups. They were anti-communist, they were Republicans, they were socialists who felt that the Bolsheviks were on the wrong path. So it's a bunch of different groups that have one thing in common. They want to undo the Bolshevik communist revolution. The other side would be the Bolsheviks themselves, those communists. They were known as the Reds. And the Red Army was the communist army led by Leon Trotsky, who was one of Lenin's top lieutenants. In fact, I want to look at this propaganda here, guys. Is this pro-red or anti-red propaganda? The answer, of course, is that is anti-red. They're trying to show that the Reds, the communists, are bloody and evil. Look at this big pile of skulls, right? They're executing people. And this is Trotsky himself. See, there's the resemblance. There's Trotsky. There he is. Now, the Red Army, at this point, again, the Red Army is the communists. They are holding the former royal family as prisoners. And they start to come to the conclusion that maybe we should kill the royal family. Why would they want to do that, you might be asking yourself? Well, the answer is, as long as the royal family are alive, it gives the White Army something to fight for, right? That we can rescue the royal family, we can put them back on the throne. But if the royal family's gone, then what exactly are you fighting for? And so in July of 1918, Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, and all of his children are murdered. They're killed right here, and this was kind of like their final prison, if you want to call it that. And they're taken down to the cellar one day, and there they're told to sit in a tight group here so they can get their picture taken. But of course, this was not a portrait. Rather, gunmen came into the room and murdered the entire family. Now, after 3 years of bloody civil war, the Reds finally won. And the reason they won is, again, the Whites had lost their rallying symbol in the royal family. Plus, they had never been truly united anyways. They'd fought a lot amongst themselves. They didn't trust the different members of the White faction. And the Red Army found it easy to kind of divide and conquer. And so they are able to win and hold on to Russia. Now again, this is going to cost the lives of approximately 3 million Russians. So that's 3 million who lost their lives in the Civil War. This is on top of the massive losses Russia suffered in World War I. So millions of Russians are dead since 1914. Now what comes out of this victory for the Reds is a new government for Russia. Going forward, it's going to be known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR. And shorthand, we just call it the Soviet Union. So from here until almost the end of the school year, when we're talking about the Soviet Union or the Soviets, again, I'm referring to communist Russia that was formed after the Reds won the Russian Civil War after World War I. Now, the reason it's called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is it was made up of a bunch of different republics that were unified together. The biggest one being the Russian one, but there was also an Estonian one, a Lithuanian one, and Ukrainian, and Georgian, and so forth. And all these had their own separate governments to answer to the national government in Moscow. It's kind of sort of the way like we have 50 states. You can think of it kind of like that. These are the different states of the Soviet Union. You can see the different flags of all the different little republics that made up the Soviet Union. All right, now let's talk about Joseph Stalin. What is his deal? Well, if you've never heard of Joseph Stalin, that's fine, but he happens to be one of the most evil men in all of history. Short of maybe Mao Zedong from China, Joseph Stalin is the most murderous, bloodiest leader in history. Again, second only to Mao Zedong. We'll talk about him later this year as well. Both of them have something in common. They're both communists, so there you go. So let's figure out how Joseph Stalin came to power. And it turns out the very year that the Soviet Union was established in 1922, Lenin suffered the first of a series of strokes, and his health declined rapidly. And knowing that Lenin is basically living on borrowed time, there's a power struggle that is set off. Who will succeed Vladimir Lenin? Who will take over his job leading the Soviet Union? The two candidates are Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Now, the two men could not have been more dissimilar. Okay, Leon Trotsky was an academic. He was an intellectual. He was a great orator and great writer. He had led the Red Army in the Russian Civil War. He looks poised to take over. He seems to be, the best candidate to take over after Lenin dies. What does Joseph Stalin bring to the table? Well, he was a committed communist like Leon Trotsky was, but the two men varied in their tactics and their strategies. Whereas Leon Trotsky, as I said, was more of an intellectual and not a very charismatic person, Stalin was a guy who had risen up really from I won't say poverty, but certainly he was not from a wealthy family. He had not a great education. He wasn't even Russian, by the way. He was Georgian. Georgia was one of those republics in the Soviet Union. And he was a guy who had grown up really on the streets. He had been involved in a lot of crimes and bank robberies and things like that. He had spent time in jail. And so you really have kind of a competition between book smarts and street smarts. And let's talk about who wins that battle. First, here is Joseph Stalin. Now, Stalin, by the way, is his assumed name. His real name was Joseph Zhugashvili. And he chose the name Stalin as sort of like his nom de guerre because Stalin in Russian means steel. Okay, so he's the man of steel, right? Tough guy, Stalin was. Here's a couple of mugshots from him in his many times of trouble. Here he is at age 15 while he was in school, and he already has kind of that smug, self-assured look to him. Here is Stalin meeting with Lenin in 1922. Lenin was a little skeptical of Stalin as well, thinking Stalin was perhaps maybe kind of not... Whereas Trotsky was more kind of strategic, Stalin was more just the bull in the china shop, right? He's just maybe too aggressive. In 1924, Lenin dies, and Stalin basically begins his campaign to oust Trotsky. Remember, that was the big power struggle, Stalin and Trotsky. Who's going to win? Who's going to take over? And Stalin is going to use violence, intimidation, blackmailing, you name it, whatever it takes to take out Trotsky. Before we talk about the finishing of that power struggle, though, I do want to say one more thing about Lenin. So when Lenin died, they put his body on display. And it was meant to be temporary at first so people could pay their respects, but it will later become permanent. The decision was made to keep Lenin's body as almost like a monument, so that future generations of Soviet citizens could see the founder of their country. And even though Lenin died almost 100 years ago, okay, his body is still on display in Moscow today. Here's his mausoleum. This says Lenin on the front in Russian, and he is inside. I kid you not, Vladimir Lenin is still on display. If you went to Moscow today, you could go check him out. There he is. Kind of creepy, you know, honestly. This is, yeah, just I don't know what to say about this other than it's just weird. Very weird. Okay, so as I said, Stalin is going to use violence and intimidation, anything he can do to push Trotsky out of the picture. It gets so bad for Trotsky that in 1929 he flees from the country. He's in exile for fear of his life. And he travels the world, and he eventually settles in Mexico. Now, Stalin was incredibly paranoid, right? Super, super paranoid. And even though Trotsky is thousands of miles away from the Soviet Union, Stalin always feared that one day he would return. So we know what's going to happen next. Stalin's agents find Trotsky in Mexico, and they break into his house, and he's murdered. This is his study. He was basically sitting at this desk when the assassin broke in. The assassin, by the way, did not kill him with a gun. He stabbed him with this ice axe, right through the skull. Trotsky lingered for a little while, but, you know, this is obviously super traumatic, and he eventually dies. And Stalin had eliminated his great rival. But the message was pretty clear that if you were on Stalin's bad side, you know, he'll hunt you down anywhere, right? I don't care where you go in this world, you're not safe. And by the way, Trotsky's body is still in Mexico today. It's never been brought back to Russia, and it probably never will. All right, guys, that is it for our study of Russia and how it's changing. Remember, World War I basically breaks Russia. It forces Czar Nicholas II to step down, and then later a second revolution happens in which the Bolsheviks, which are communists, took over. Lenin became the leader of the Soviet Union. He helped the Soviet Union, helped lead Russia, communist Russia, through a civil war between the Reds and the Whites, and then the Soviet Union was established. And then after Lenin died, Stalin took over, and Stalin, of course, is a man of extreme brutality. And we'll talk a lot more about Stalin later because, yeah, he has a lot more to his story. That's also it for our World War I unit, guys. So in our next unit, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how the world was changing between the wars, between World War I and World War II. And before you know it, we'll be on to the Second World War.